China's bullying just backfired in the worst possible way. On August 11th, two heavily armed Chinese ships, a Coast Guard cutter, which by the way used to be an actual warship, and a massive Type 052 destroyer were aggressively chasing a much smaller Philippine Coast Guard vessel, BRP Suluan, near Scarborough Shoal. This stretch of sea, just off the coast of the Philippines, is one of the most dangerously contested spots on Earth. It rightfully belongs to the Philippines under international law, yet China insists it is Chinese territory and has been chasing off anyone or anything that floats through the area, be it boats, ships, or even fishermen. This time was no different. According to journalists on board, the Chinese vessel had already nearly collided twice earlier during the chase. But when they tried a third maneuver to box in the Suluan, the Chinese destroyer got a little too eager, tried to cut it off at full speed, lost control, and ended up slamming directly into its own Coast Guard cutter, causing a massive collision. The craziest part is that the Philippines didn't fire a single shot or act aggressively, yet somehow two Chinese vessels were badly damaged, one so severely that it was left unseaworthy and had to be towed away. That's a whole new level of international humiliation. But let's not forget, this was just a scratch for China. If that destroyer had smashed into the Philippine ship instead of its own cutter, we'd be talking about something far deadlier. Dozens of casualties, maybe the Suluan at the bottom of the sea, and a chain reaction that could have literally spiraled into major international crisis, if not outright war. And trust me, everyone knows the Philippines isn't in a position to wage war with China. That's just the reality. And that fact, right there, is exactly what Beijing is counting on as it tries to take over the entirety of the South China Sea. In a moment, you'll see why China's playing a dangerous game by bullying not just one or two, but more than 5 nations at the same time, how it's nearly a tipping point, and why the consequences could be severe. But first, what's in this for China? Now look, I've already done a bunch of videos breaking down why the South China Sea is so valuable economically and strategically, so I'm not just gonna bore you by repeating all that. But just in case you're new around here, or maybe you haven't watched any of these videos before, here's the short version. This sea spans some 3.5 million square miles, and it's filled with countless tiny islands, coral reefs, and lagoons. The big ones you've probably heard of are the Spratly Islands in the south, the Paracels up to the north, Scarborough Shoal to the east, plus a handful of others scattered throughout. Economically speaking, about 1/3 of the world's shipping passes through here. Back in 2016, the trade value moving through these waters was about $3.4 trillion. Today, that number has shot up to between $5 and $7 trillion annually. Moreover, the sea is absolutely loaded with resources. According to US estimates, the South China Sea holds around 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and around 11 billion barrels of proven and probable oil reserves. But the majority of these confirmed oil and gas fields lie closer to countries like Vietnam and Malaysia. That's exactly why China aggressively harasses them so close to their own coastlines. And let's not forget the fish. This sea is one of the richest maritime environments on the planet. Millions of people rely on its fisheries every single day for food, income, and survival. Right now, these waters belong legally to multiple nations, each fishing within its own zone. But if China fully controls the South China Sea, it could literally hold entire countries hostage by restricting their access to food. Lastly, there's the strategic value. Experts call the South China Sea the throat of the Western Pacific and Indian Oceans. Practically every ship hauling oil and goods from the Indian Ocean into China, Japan, and South Korea has to pass through a tiny choke point called the Strait of Malacca, right by Singapore. For these countries, especially China, this strait is literally a lifeline. China alone relies heavily on Middle Eastern oil, most of which travels through Malacca. But it's also a massive vulnerability. If things ever turned ugly, it wouldn't take much for a rival navy, like the US or its allies, to blockade Malacca and completely choke off China's oil supply overnight. Also, if China tries to take Taiwan, then this strait would be the main approach route for any naval force coming from the west. Controlling this sea could literally let Beijing block American ships from ever getting close enough to intervene effectively. That is why Beijing is so obsessed with dominating and controlling these waters, not just for the gas, oil, or fisheries, but also because holding the sea means building a strategic wall, a protective barrier to keep threats away from China's shores. If you think the world needs to know what happens when smaller nations try to stand up to a superpower, well, hit like and subscribe. Your support helps push this story beyond the algorithm and past the narratives Beijing wants you to believe. The truth is, this obsession started decades ago. Chinese strategists came up with a concept they called the First Island Chain, a line that stretches south from Japan, through Taiwan, all the way down to Malaysia. It's basically a natural defensive wall made up of islands, reefs, and narrow sea passages that lock China in, blocking direct access to the Pacific Ocean. It's like China stuck behind a massive fence, and the ocean beyond is just out of reach. Now, one of the guys who really made this idea famous was Admiral Liu Hua-chiong, often called the father of China's modern navy. He insisted that China's navy would never be truly powerful or truly secure unless it broke through this island chain and operated freely. Once China achieves that, there'd be almost nothing left standing in its way. That's exactly why China went on the spree of island building and military base construction. But before we jump into that, you first need to understand just how strange and how flimsy China's claim over the South China Sea really is. For decades, the Chinese Communist Party has carefully crafted this narrative, mostly targeting their own citizens, that these waters have always belonged to China. School textbooks, official maps, propaganda films all portray a continuous Chinese presence and sovereignty over these waters for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But let's go back to the end of World War II. Japan had taken control of many islands in the South China Sea during the war, but after Japan surrendered, those islands suddenly had no official owner. In 1951, delegates from dozens of nations met in San Francisco to sign a peace treaty, and Japan formally gave up its claims to the Spratly and Paracel Islands. But the treaty didn't say who got to inherit those islands. It just left them floating in like a legal limbo. And this ambiguity set the stage for decades of disputes, confrontations, and ultimately, a situation China would later exploit to the fullest. In the late 1940s, China came up with its first formal claim over the South China Sea. Well, sort of. At that time, the Chinese government, under Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime, drew up this bizarre map with an 11-dash line that looped almost the entire South China Sea. Chiang's regime needed nationalist fervor to unite its fragmented country, and hoped exaggerated territorial claims would strengthen public support. Well, it didn't. When the communist government took over mainland China, it tweaked that claim slightly in 1953, simplifying it to the infamous 9-dash line. To this very day, you'll still find that exact same 9-dash line printed in Chinese passports, official maps, textbooks, and government documents. Yet, even for decades, China has never provided exact coordinates, clear legal justification, or solid historical proof to back it up. They're basically like, if we repeat it enough, maybe everyone else will just stop asking questions. If you ask Chinese officials why they think this entire sea belongs to them, they'll pull out old records from ancient fishermen or explorers who sailed these waters centuries ago. Maybe flash you a dusty 15th century map and call it proof. That's literally it. No other country in the world has ever agreed to China's claim of practically the whole South China Sea, and modern international law certainly doesn't either. Meanwhile, other countries around the South China Sea do have their own legitimate arguments. Vietnam, for instance, says it inherited the Paracels and Spratlys from the Nguyen dynasty and the French colonial administration. The Philippines bases its claim on proximity and discovery, particularly a Filipino explorer who discovered some Spratly inlets in 1956, annexing them officially as the Kalayaan Island Group. Malaysia claims a portion of the Spratlys based on the continental shelf extending from its coastline. Brunei claims one reef within its exclusive economic zone. And lastly, Taiwan holds onto the biggest natural Spratly island called Ituaba. By the way, did you know it was Taiwan's government that originally drew the 11-dash line before fleeing to Taiwan? And just like mainland China, even Taiwan claims almost the entire South China Sea. So yeah, it's definitely complicated. But notice something. Out of all 6 claimants, China is literally the only one consistently bullying everyone else to back up their claims. But why did China only make these claims after World War II? Well, before that, China had way bigger issues to handle. First came the brutal Japanese invasion in the 1930s, where Japan ruthlessly took control of vast parts of China. Millions of Chinese were killed, cities were destroyed, and the entire country was plunged into chaos. China barely had control over its own mainland, let alone some distant islands in the South China Sea. Then, immediately after World War II ended in 1945 and Japan withdrew, China descended straight into a violent civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists. The civil war lasted 4 years, devastating the country even further. Yet, even during that short gap between the end of World War II and the communist takeover, Chiang's nationalist government did manage to plant a seed, the 11-dash line. But once Mao took control in 1949, China again descended into chaos. Mao's disastrous campaigns, the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution wrecked the country from the inside out, with millions starving and society collapsing. Other countries in the region were also too busy recovering from World War II, and frankly, these tiny islands scattered in the middle of nowhere didn't seem worth much attention. That is until oil was discovered in 1968. After that, everything changed. A United Nations-sponsored Chinese-sponsored geological survey reported potential oil reserves hidden beneath the seabed of the South China Sea. Suddenly, those worthless little rocks started looking pretty juicy to everyone. By the early 1970s, the race was on, and getting heated. Countries in the region, still struggling from decades of war and poverty, saw an opportunity to strike it rich. The Philippines wasted no time. By 1976, they'd already hit oil near Palawan, just outside the Spratlys. Vietnam invited foreign companies to explore the waters near its coast. Everyone wanted to stake their territory. And where was China during all this? Well, truth be told, they were watching closely and waiting patiently. China wasn't quite ready yet, but it knew exactly what it wanted. Mao's chaotic rule had just ended, and the country still had minor issues to deal with. But now, seeing other nations hungrily grabbing territory, China realized it had to move, or risk getting left behind completely. China's navy was still weak, barely able to patrol its own coastline. But this was a golden opportunity China just couldn't afford to miss. Luckily for Beijing, the timing couldn't have been better. Their closest competitor, South Vietnam, was trapped in a brutal civil war. Communist forces from Hanoi were pounding South Vietnam cities. American troops were packing up and heading home. Saigon's military was desperately trying to just survive. The whole region was distracted, vulnerable, and perfectly ripe for the taking. China saw its chance in the Paracel Islands. These islands were small, mostly barren, scattered with bird droppings and old fishermen's huts. But strategically, they were gold. Controlling the Paracels meant China could project naval and air power deep into the South China Sea, and that made them worth every risk. So in January of 1974, a small Chinese naval fleet approached the islands and soon ran head-on into the South Vietnamese warships that were stationed there. China's navy sank a Vietnamese warship and killed about 74 South Vietnamese sailors. The rest were forced to retreat, abandoning the island to China. Just like that, the Paracel Islands became Chinese territory. And almost immediately, China fortified its new prize. They set up heavily militarized outposts and deployed troops. For China, it was a quick victory with almost zero international backlash. Even the United States, South Vietnam's closest ally, didn't lift a finger. A small clash over distant islands simply wasn't worth another fight. So the US quietly looked the other way. China couldn't believe its luck. It was an easy victory, a free pass, practically an open invitation to keep going. But for Vietnam, it was a deep humiliation, one they haven't forgotten even today. To this day, Vietnam still officially claims the Paracel Islands as theirs, occasionally sending patrol ships close to Chinese waters in protest. But realistically, China's control is rock solid. They've permanently stationed about 1,000 troops there, reinforced bunkers, built radar sites, and turned the islands into a military stronghold. The Paracels are firmly in Chinese hands, and everyone knows it. Yet China wasn't done, not by a long shot. By the 1980s, their ambitions were growing again, and they started looking further south, to the Spratly Islands. By then, Vietnam already had troops stationed on several reefs in the Spratly chain, but China wanted a foothold of its own. So on March 14, 1988, Chinese and Vietnam naval forces came face-to-face near Johnson's South Reef. It quickly escalated from a standoff into a firefight. Within minutes, several Vietnamese transport ships had been sunk, and between 64 to 74 Vietnamese sailors lay dead. China had once again used force to muscle its way into a contested part of the South China Sea, and once again, it walked away with new territory. After this clash, China took control of a few more reefs in the Spratlys. One of these was Fiery Cross Reef, at the time just a tiny, mostly submerged coral patch. Decades later, China would dredge millions of tons of sand and turn it into a massive artificial island with a 3-kilometer-long runway, missile defense systems, radar installations, and ports capable of docking warships. These aggressive moves throughout the 70s and the 80s cemented China's reputation as the region's most notorious bully, and naturally everyone started resenting them for it. Eventually, even China realized it was attracting too much unwanted attention, especially after these bloody battles in 1974 and 1988. The world was starting to watch a bit too closely, and Beijing knew it couldn't keep grabbing islands through open conflict. So China's strategists came up with a quieter, smarter tactic, what experts now call salami slicing. It's like carefully cutting off thin slices of territory bit by bit, claiming a reef here, setting up an outpost there, always small enough to seem harmless, yet effective enough to gradually reshape control over the region without provoking serious international backlash or triggering an open war. In fact, the recent ship ramming incident you saw at the beginning of this video is a perfect example of this strategy. Sure, it caused some outrage. That's probably one reason you're even watching this video right now. But how long do you think that attention is going to last? A couple of weeks, at best? Then everybody moves on, and China quietly consolidates a little more influence. They've been repeating exactly the strategy since the 1990s. Take Mischief Reef, for example. In early 1995, this tiny, barely noticeable submerged coral reef, about 130 nautical miles off the coast of Palawan in the Philippines, was still completely unoccupied. It sat well within the Philippines' internationally recognized exclusive economic zone, legally theirs by every standard. It had zero human presence, zero strategic value. At least, it seemed that way. But in just a matter of days, Filipino fishermen out on routine trips were shocked to find a group of strange new buildings with Chinese flags waving above them. For plausible deniability, Beijing claimed these were just fishermen's shelters. But nobody believed that story, not even for a second. And sure enough, it was only a matter of time before China began dredging the reef and moving military assets into the area. Manila immediately protested, and neighboring ASEAN countries quickly raised concerns too, worried they'd be next on Beijing's list. It soon escalated into a tense diplomatic standoff. The Philippines even arrested some Chinese fishermen nearby, hoping to gain leverage at the bargaining table. Eventually, after weeks of diplomatic back and forth, China agreed to vague talks about a code of conduct to ease the tension. But the Chinese never actually left Mischief Reef. Instead, they quietly kept dredging sand, enlarging the reef, building military infrastructure, and locking down their position. By the time things finally settled down, China had managed to slice off yet another strategic chunk of territory, right in front of everyone's eyes. And once again, they'd gotten away with it. Just to make things even more unbearable, China also began passing domestic laws and issuing endless statements to solidify its claims. In 1992, they passed the Law on Territorial Seas, declaring outright sovereignty over all of the Paracel and Spratly Islands, claiming they had historical rights dating all the way back to the Han Dynasty over 2,000 years ago, but as usual, provided no proof or credible evidence to back it up. At the same time, China was also busy talking nicely with ASEAN countries, discussing some sort of code of conduct that would supposedly calm everyone down and avoid conflicts. On paper, it sounded pretty good, but it was mostly just a smart move by China to stop the other 5 nations from getting together, and China was also stalling for time. To ASEAN's credit, they did manage to persuade China into signing a non-binding declaration of conduct back in 2002. In it, everyone agreed they'd resolve disputes peacefully, avoid aggressive moves, and not occupy any new islands or reefs. But there's a big catch. The DOC was intentionally kept vague. It had zero enforcement power, no clear penalties, and no way of punishing any country that broke the rules. Why? Because China had absolutely refused to sign anything that would restrict their freedom of action. They insisted it had to be non-binding and strictly voluntary, meaning nobody could force China or anyone else to comply. And that was exactly the point. China used the DOC to drag endless negotiations about the finer details, definitions, and wording, while simultaneously continuing to quietly dredge reefs, build runways, radar stations, military bases, and fortify the islands they already controlled. ASEAN became effectively powerless, stuck in permanent diplomatic limbo, endlessly talking but never able to take real action to stop China's creeping takeover. And if that wasn't enough, China would also play a game of sticks and carrots. Sometimes Beijing would charm other countries with offers of cooperation, like when Deng Xiaoping proposed joint development, suggesting everyone set aside disputes and share resources. But that offer also meant sharing on Chinese terms, accept the deal or face constant bullying and harassment. Vietnam learned this the hard way. When Hanoi turned down Beijing's proposal, Chinese fishing boats and naval vessels began regularly intruding into Vietnamese waters, deliberately interfering with their oil and gas exploration. Chinese ships would ram Vietnamese fishing boats, chase research vessels, and aggressively disrupt surveys. In 2011, for example, Vietnamese ships conducting seismic research deep inside their own exclusive economic zone had their seismic cables intentionally cut by Chinese vessels. Not just once, but twice, within only a few weeks. Around the same time, the Philippines experienced similar harassment. Chinese vessels aggressively disrupted exploration near Reed Bank off Palawan, forcing Manila to scramble fighter jets to assert its territorial rights. China's approach is simple but extremely effective. Instead of firing missiles or guns and risking an outright war, it prefers using Coast Guard vessels and ships disguised as civilian fishing boats to harass and intimidate other nations. Experts call it the cabbage strategy. Here's how it works. China slowly surrounds contested islands or reefs with layers upon layers of ships. First come the fishing boats, innocent-looking but operated by maritime militia crews who aggressively crowd and threaten anyone who tries to get too close. Behind them, China positions larger Coast Guard vessels. And then, far behind, heavily armed naval warships quietly patrol. waiting, just in case things escalate. By the time anyone realizes what's happening and tries to protest, China ships have been there for weeks or even months, making their presence seem totally normal. Complaints look weak. Resistance feels pointless, and before anyone knows it, the area is effectively under China's control, without firing a single shot. In 2010, China's foreign minister Yang Jiechi bluntly told diplomats from Southeast Asia that China was simply bigger and stronger, and their countries were weak and insignificant. That was just the way things were. It was an intentionally humiliating message, openly delivered without the slightest care for diplomatic niceties or consequences. And if you think what you've heard so far sounds bad, just hold on, because it's nothing compared to what happened when Xi Jinping took power in 2013. Under Xi, China's bullying got nastier, bolder, and so aggressive that it became impossible for the rest of the world to look the other way. Remember Scarborough Shoal from earlier? Yes, the same place where those two Chinese ships embarrassingly collided just a few days ago. Turns out more than a decade earlier, back in April of 2012, a Philippine Navy frigate had spotted a group of Chinese fishing boats near Scarborough, reportedly harvesting endangered giant clams and illegally collecting corals. When the Philippines tried to arrest them, China quickly sent in Coast Guard ships, triggering an intense and heated standoff. For weeks, the two sides traded insults and aggressive maneuvers. Finally, 3 months later, in June, the US informally stepped in to mediate an agreement. Both sides were supposed to withdraw their ships and end the standoff peacefully. The Philippines trusted the deal and pulled the ships out, but China never left. Instead, China moved in more ships and physically blocked off the lagoon entrance. They even roped it off so Philippine fishermen couldn't enter. From that moment forward, Filipino fishing communities that relied heavily on Scarborough Shoal found themselves completely shut out. Chinese Coast Guard vessels regularly chased them off, blasted them with water cannons, or made close passes to rock their boats and even drown them. This incident was a brutal wake-up call for Washington. Then there's the Great Wall of Sand. Starting in late 2013 and ramping up in 2015, China launched a massive island-building campaign at 7 reefs in the Spratly Islands it had previously taken from Vietnam, the Philippines, and others. China literally dredged sand from the seabed. Within a few short years, China created over 3,200 acres of entirely new land. Some reefs and shoals that weren't even visible at low tides now had runways, buildings, and military bases so massive you could literally see them from space. By the time Washington realized what China was actually up to, the islands were practically done. That's why, in 2015, the US began conducting what they call Freedom of Navigation Operations, or FONOPs. In October, a US-guided missile destroyer, the USS Lassen, deliberately sailed within 12 nautical miles of Subi Reef, directly challenging China's territorial claims around its new artificial islands. China, predictably, was furious. Beijing immediately sent in its navy to shadow the American ships, broadcasting angry radio warnings, demanding the USS Lassen leave Chinese territory. But the US kept sailing, and these FONOPs continue even today, regularly reminding China and the rest of the world that these artificial islands don't legally give China any new territorial waters. In fact, even this month, on August 13th, just 2 days after the embarrassing collision between China's own ships, the US Navy sailed right through the same waters. The guided missile destroyer USS Higgins and the littoral combat ship USS Cincinnati cruised near Scarborough Shoal, closely shadowed by yet another Chinese warship. For Southeast Asian nations, this daily tension is becoming painfully normal. Imagine living next to a superpower that never stops pushing, constantly testing your boundaries, patiently waiting for a chance to snatch territory or deny access to your own waters. Today, China's Coast Guard has become the largest in the world. So huge, it's practically evolved into a second navy. In 2018, China merged multiple smaller maritime agencies into a single, powerful Coast Guard force directly controlled by the military. Almost immediately afterward, Beijing started rapidly building and deploying huge, ultra-modern vessels, some even bigger and tougher than actual naval destroyers. These ships have reinforced hulls, specifically designed for aggressive maneuvers like ramming, advanced military-grade radars to track vessels over vast areas, and heavy 76mm cannons capable of inflicting some serious damage. Which is why, even now, in 2025, China still undeniably has the upper hand, at least in raw military power. None of these Southeast Asian nations can realistically match China ship for ship, jet for jet, or dollar for dollar. But what's really changing lately is the resolve, unity, of those nations that refuse to accept Chinese dominance. From Vietnam fortifying its island outposts, to the Philippines re-embracing its American alliance, openly hosting US bases again and inviting joint patrols with countries like Australia and Japan, to Malaysia and Indonesia confidently pushing ahead with oil and gas projects despite Beijing's interference, the region is finally uniting against China's relentless bullying. China's bullying tactics used to pay off. Other nations once stayed quiet, afraid to provoke the dragon. But these days, instead of scaring neighbors into submission, China's aggressive moves are strengthening their resolve. The truth is, China's running out of moves. Sure, they can still harass, intimidate, or ram fishing boats, but they consistently stop short of open military conflict. Why? Because even Beijing understands that starting a real war is the quickest way to trigger American intervention, massive international backlash, and potentially crippling economic isolation. Exactly the kind of nightmare scenario the Chinese leadership desperately wants to avoid. Ironically, China's hesitation to escalate into open conflict is exactly what's given smaller nations the confidence to push back harder. Sure, Beijing can flood the region with hundreds of ships and aircraft, but it still can't fully lock down control without risking a war it desperately wants to avoid. On the other side, these smaller countries can't completely kick China out, but they can sure as hell deny Beijing the clean, uncontested victory it's craving. And every time China pushes too far, ramming fishing boats, blasting water cannons, or pointing blinding lasers, it only fuels stronger resistance from the international community, weakening its own strategic hand. At the same time, China's historic claims, those maps and stories about ancient fishermen and old voyages, have been thoroughly debunked by international law. No other country on Earth supports Beijing's idea that the South China Sea should be China's personal lake. And because of China's increasingly aggressive actions, nations around the globe that previously stayed neutral or kept quiet are now openly stepping up and calling Beijing out. Even the United States, which just a decade ago limited itself mostly to symbolic patrols, is now actively setting up a more permanent rotational military presence right in the Philippines. This scenario is exactly what Beijing was desperately trying to avoid from the start, an expanded American military footprint sitting right at China's doorstep. If China had shown just a little bit of patience, played its hand quietly, or genuinely tried negotiating, it probably could have kept America at arm's length. Instead, it created the exact coalition of rivals it most feared. Some might say China's artificial islands give it a military advantage. And yeah, these bases would definitely be the front line in a real conflict, but they're also vulnerable, fixed targets that other countries are preparing countermeasures for. Regional powers are buying sophisticated anti-ship missiles, advanced radar systems, and modernizing their navies to deal specifically with these island fortresses. Even the US and its allies have adjusted their tactics, focusing on dispersed operations, submarines, and long-range weapons designed to neutralize China's island bases in wartime. And it's not just America. China's aggressive push into the South China Sea has attracted more foreign naval presence than ever before. In 2021, Britain's Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier battle group deliberately sailed through the South China Sea, something that wouldn't have happened without China's provocations. India, too, is increasingly sailing its warships through the South China Sea, partly to send Beijing a message. By unilaterally trying to reshape the region, China has accidentally encouraged a global coalition dedicated to containing its ambitions. If China continues on its current path, we will almost certainly see more frequent clashes. Not necessarily open warfare, but constant close calls, incidents, so to say, at sea, and dangerous standoffs. There's simply no indication that China plans on backing down. Quite the opposite, actually. Just a few years ago, China passed a new law allowing its Coast Guard ships to use weapons in areas it claims as its own waters, whenever it decides its sovereignty is at risk, which basically means whenever it feels like it. So, unfortunately, that leaves us with one conclusion. China has always acted like a bully, and it's still acting like one now. And it'll keep behaving this way unless someone finally pushes back hard enough to stop it. In the end, you have to ask yourself, what exactly has China gained from all this bullying? Sure, they've managed to grab thousands of acres of artificial islands, along with potential access to massive oil and gas reserves. But those artificial islands are also costly to maintain. Some are already sinking, and others are eroding. And if war ever breaks out, they're just giant targets waiting to be hit. They've chased fishermen away, but fish populations in the region are already collapsing anyway. When it comes to oil and gas, China barely touched them. But honestly, who wants to partner with a bully that could stab you in the back at any moment? Most of China's drilling still happens close to its own coastline. The deeper reserves in the disputed South China Sea, supposedly so valuable, remain almost completely untapped, all thanks to the constant tension and mistrust Beijing has created. Ultimately, if China keeps bullying its neighbors, it'll pay a heavy price. What kind of price? Possibly a devastating conflict that destroys decades of economic growth? including China's own, possibly an endless arms race along its borders, sucking up resources better spent on improving domestic welfare, or maybe just the permanent instability and mistrust in a region China desperately wants to dominate. There's an old saying, you can win every battle but still lose the war, and that's exactly where China is headed right now. It has won countless small battles in the South China Sea, but it's slowly losing the larger war for regional influence, stability, and trust. Fear can keep smaller countries quiet for a while, but fear alone is weak. Eventually, those you bully find protectors, band together, and isolate the bully. Thanks for watching.